stop for a moment, because what is unfolding right now does not fit into any familiar political pattern. In the last 24 hours, a quiet but extraordinary shift has taken place inside the American state. Not a speech, not a vote, not a court ruling, an institutional refusal. The Pentagon has drawn a line, not against a foreign adversary, not against Congress, but against a former president who is once again pressing the boundaries of authority and finding them unexpectedly firm. This is not noise. This is not theater. This is the military establishment signaling unmistakably that it will not move where it believes the Constitution does not authorize movement. According to multiple defense officials speaking on background, senior Pentagon leadership convened an emergency internal session late last night. The meeting stretched into the early morning hours inside the E-Ring, involving top civilian and uniformed leadership. The topic: demands originating from Trump-aligned channels that the Department of Defense viewed as politically motivated and operationally improper. By morning, the decision had been made. Distance, clarification, refusal. Publicly, the language is restrained, carefully legal, almost bland, but the meaning is unmistakable. The United States military serves the Constitution, not any individual, a Defense Department spokesperson stated, echoing a principle that is rarely needed to be said out loud until now. Privately, officials describe something more serious, a coordinated determination to block any attempt to draw the armed forces into domestic political operations that blur the line between military authority and civilian law enforcement. The demands themselves were not unprecedented. Donald Trump has, for years, argued for expansive use of military resources in contexts that blur the line between external defense and internal control, border enforcement, domestic deployment. The framing has always been security. The implication, power. What makes this moment different is not the request. It is the moment in which it arrived. Post-election. A landscape already crowded with court battles, retaliatory language, and institutional fatigue. A system stretched thin by distrust, not just between parties, but between branches. Timing matters in power struggles, and this timing changed everything. According to sources familiar with the situation, the first outreach never touched formal channels. No written request, no official directive, no paper trail. Instead, there were informal contacts, exploratory conversations, quiet feelers extended under the language of preparedness. Not orders, suggestions, not demands, questions. The kind of approach designed to test resistance without triggering alarms. At first, those feelers went nowhere. The responses were cautious, non-committal, deliberately vague. Institutions trained to survive political cycles know how to slow momentum without provoking confrontation. But the effort did not stop. When informal paths closed, pressure increased. The language hardened. What had been framed as planning began to resemble expectation. Requests traveled upward, bypassing intermediaries, landing closer to senior leadership. That escalation is what triggered the review. Not a routine assessment, an emergency one. This matters because emergency reviews are not convened lightly. They are not political reactions. They are risk calculations. When institutions initiate them, it means someone has concluded that normal guardrails may no longer hold. The outcome was unambiguous. A hard stop. No engagement without explicit constitutional authorization. No informal cooperation. No ambiguity. Each line was deliberate, each clause designed to eliminate interpretation. This was not caution, it was refusal, and more importantly, it was collective. What followed was not a memo quietly filed and forgotten. It was an institutional posture, a shared understanding across command structures that the boundary had been reached. That distinction is critical. Policies can be reversed, memos can be rewritten, but postures are harder to undo. A posture signals how an institution will respond before a request even arrives. It sets expectation. It closes doors in advance. By drawing that line, the institution did something subtle but profound. It removed flexibility, and flexibility is where power often hides. There would be no gray zone to exploit, no helpful cooperation, no deniability later. Everything would either be lawful or it would not happen. That stance carries consequences. Internally, it reshapes communication. Messages are filtered differently. Conversations tighten. Language becomes precise. When ambiguity disappears, so does improvisation. Externally, it sends a signal, not to voters, not to the media, but to other institutions watching closely. It says, this boundary is real. In moments of stress, systems reveal their true architecture, not through declarations, but through resistance. The fact that this effort was halted, not delayed, not softened, but stopped, speaks to how seriously it was taken. And it explains why the response was so firm. This was not about policy disagreement. It was about constitutional exposure, about precedent, about what happens if a line is crossed and later becomes normal. Institutions do not fear controversy as much as they fear normalization. Once something happens once, it becomes easier to justify the second time. That is how extraordinary actions quietly become routine. The emergency review recognized that risk, and it acted accordingly. By refusing informal cooperation, the institution forced any future attempt into the open, into written orders, into constitutional scrutiny, into places where accountability exists. That move alone changes the balance. It doesn't end pressure, it doesn't dissolve intent, but it raises the cost. And in power struggles, raising the cost is often the only way to slow momentum. This is why the moment matters, not because of what was requested, but because of how the system responded. When institutions stop negotiating in the shadows and insist on daylight, something fundamental has shifted. And once that shift occurs, the consequences extend far beyond the original request. They redefine the rules for everything that follows. Trump responded as expected, loudly, publicly, immediately. Accusations of unnamed deep state bureaucrats, betrayal, sabotage, sabers rattling on social media, cable news exploded, surrogates appeared everywhere, repeating the script like clockwork. The familiar rhythm returned, defiance, anger, projection, performance. But then something else emerged. Silence. Not the calm of consideration, not the polite pause of routine debate. Actual silence. From figures who once rushed to his defense, from military veterans in Congress who understand the weight of words, the cost of missteps, the implications when the Pentagon signals caution or withholds it, from Republican lawmakers who know precisely what it means when institutions pause. This is not how routine disagreements look. This is how confidence collapses. The absence of reaction speaks louder than any statement. It signals calculation, fear, recognition of risk. It signals that the machinery of power, the machinery Trump thought he controlled, has internal limits. And when confidence collapses, the performance no longer matters. No amount of tweets, no flurry of surrogates, no spectacle on television can recreate it. Silence is decisive. It does not debate. It does not negotiate. It communicates a truth that even rhetoric cannot obscure. The foundations are cracking. This is not drama. This is consequence. This is the moment when the familiar script meets a system that refuses to follow it blindly. Inside Washington, the effect is already spreading. Hallways in Capitol Hill hum with quiet recalibration. Conversations that once carried certainty now carry caution. Even staunch GOP allies are measured, careful with phrases, emphasizing constitutional norms over personal loyalty. Every word is weighed, every statement calculated. One Republican senator, speaking off the record, cut through the politeness. "We can't survive another institutional crisis." That is the kind of statement that changes strategy overnight. Hesitation here is not indecision. It is survival instinct, and it matters. Because the Pentagon does not act in a vacuum. Its posture is not just words. It activates a chain reaction. Reports are filed. Oversight mechanisms kick in, mandatory briefings are scheduled, paper trails are created, every action leaves evidence, every directive triggers review, every hesitation, or lack thereof, is documented. This is how institutions reinforce themselves, not with headlines, not with speeches, but with procedural inevitability. Washington feels the ripple, not as a storm, but as a tide reshaping expectations. When the Pentagon signals concern or refuses informal cooperation, everything downstream adjusts. Congress notices, staffers notice, intelligence agencies notice, and the quiet message is unmistakable. The system is watching, the system is acting, and it will not wait. In that environment, silence is deafening. Loyalty is no longer a shield. Certainty is no longer assumed. Every decision now comes with risk. Every word carries weight. This is how confidence collapses, not with shouting or spectacle, but with the slow, unstoppable force of institutions asserting their authority. By day's end, the Department of Defense is poised to file formal documentation with Congress. Every refused request, every denied directive, every boundary enforced. That single act opens doors that cannot be closed. Hearings are almost certain, likely under the Armed Services Committees. Where testimony is no longer commentary, it becomes evidence. Where ambiguity evaporates under oath, and the clock begins to tick. If Trump or his allies tries to escalate through back channels, informal directives, or surrogate pressure, the legal machinery kicks in. Courts take notice. Judges examine intent. They ask hard questions. Was the chain of command circumvented? Were laws or procedures ignored? Was obstruction intentional? Each action becomes a documented event. Each misstep is captured. Each violation can be traced and referenced. In this environment, improvisation is dangerous. Informal maneuvers carry real consequences. Every move is visible. Every word is accountable. Washington watches, the judiciary watches, the military watches. The system is no longer reactive. It is procedural, deliberate, and relentless. And in that scrutiny, certainty collapses, not with fanfare, but with unyielding process. At that point, this stops being politics and becomes enforcement. Not speeches, not messaging, not optics. Enforcement. Behind the scenes, federal agencies are already shifting posture, quietly, methodically, with no press releases and no applause. This is not the kind of movement meant to be seen, it's meant to be effective. Intelligence officials are monitoring communications for signs of improper contact with active duty personnel, not rumors, not vibes, signals, patterns, deviations from protocol. The kind of anomalies that don't matter until suddenly they matter a great deal. Cyber units are on alert, not because of a single post or a single account, but because disinformation doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps, it fragments, it tests boundaries. The concern isn't persuasion, it's erosion, undermining confidence in military leadership, creating doubt about lawful authority, blurring the line between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to individuals. The objective is containment, prevent spillover, prevent escalation, prevent rhetoric from turning into operational risk. This level of coordination does not happen casually. Agencies don't realign priorities on instinct. They do it when thresholds are crossed, when language, timing, and context combine into something more than noise. It happens when institutions believe a line must be held now, not later. Because later is how things break. Inside the federal system, this is what seriousness looks like. Not panic, not drama, documentation, alerts, interagency calls, legal reviews, everything routed through process, everything recorded, no improvisation, no freelancing. And once that machinery starts moving, it doesn't stop easily. Internationally, the signal is being read just as clearly. Allies are watching not what is said, but how the system responds. They've seen populist surges before. They've survived rhetoric. What they measure now is institutional resilience. Does the United States still enforce its own rules when pressure is applied? Do civilian and military authorities remain clearly separated? Does the chain of command hold? So far, the answer appears to be yes. That matters more than statements, more than summits, more than reassurance calls. Adversaries are watching too, but for different reasons. They're looking for cracks, for hesitation, for signs that internal division can be leveraged. What they see instead is something colder and more dangerous to them: procedure. Procedure is hard to exploit. Procedure doesn't react emotionally. Procedure doesn't rush. It waits. Then it acts. This is why the moment feels heavier than previous confrontations. Not louder, heavier. Because once enforcement begins, there is no audience to perform for, only rules to follow and consequences to manage. Inside Washington, that shift is understood instinctively. Staffers stop speculating, officials stop freelancing, conversations become clipped, legal, careful. People start asking not, "What do we say?" but, "What exposure does this create?" That's the tell. Politics thrives on ambiguity, enforcement destroys it, and ambiguity is already disappearing. Every communication is now viewed through a different lens, every outreach re-examined, every statement assessed not for political impact, but for compliance, for intent, for risk. This is where power actually changes hands, not through votes or outrage, but through process. Because once institutions decide they are no longer negotiating norms but defending them, the ground shifts. Suddenly, escalation isn't about dominance, it's about restraint. And restraint, paradoxically, is what signals strength. No one involved believes this resolves quickly. Enforcement phases never do. They stretch, they grind, they produce reports instead of headlines, and they reshape behavior long before outcomes are announced. The most important thing happening right now isn't visible on television. It's happening in briefings without cameras, in memos without names, in decisions framed as routine but treated as decisive. This is the system drawing a boundary. Not loudly, not emotionally, but unmistakably. And once that boundary is drawn, crossing it is no longer a political act. It's a violation. That's when the story changes. NATO issued a measured statement. Publicly, calm. Privately, concerned. Confidence in American democratic resilience was reaffirmed, but the subtext was clear. Allies are already asking quiet, pointed questions about command reliability, succession planning, and continuity of operations. They are not alarmed yet, but they are listening very closely. Across the globe, China's state media seized the moment. Predictably, it framed the events as evidence of American fracture. The narrative is simple: the world's leading democracy paralyzed from within. Russian outlets followed suit, pushing the chaos story, amplifying every misstep and hesitation. Both see an opportunity. Markets reacted, not with panic, but with caution. Defense stocks dipped in after-hours trading. Investors are reading the same signals as allies: procedural stress, institutional friction, uncertainty. The numbers are small, but the signal is unmistakable. Stress has consequences, even if collapse does not follow. This is the shift. It is no longer about one man, one demand, one scandal. It is about the resilience of institutions, the military, the judiciary, the legislature, designed to be apolitical, designed to withstand pressure from any single political actor, designed to endure. But what happens when that system faces sustained, coordinated pressure from a political movement that views restraint as betrayal? That question is no longer hypothetical. It is operational. It is procedural. It is being measured in reports, in memos, in briefings where every word is recorded, every nuance noted. The tension is real. It is quiet. It is structural. Not the loud, chaotic turmoil of street protests or partisan bickering, but the subtle, grinding stress of institutions defending their rules against those who would exploit ambiguity. And that is what makes this moment different. Not personalities, not rallies, not social media, but process, enforcement, observation, the slow, deliberate assertion that rules matter, that lines exist, that boundaries will not bend for anyone. This is the heartbeat of governance under pressure. The system is being tested, not because of incompetence or mismanagement, but because it is confronting a challenge unprecedented in scale and intensity. A political force that interprets procedural adherence as obstruction. Stress is measurable, confidence is fragile, yet resilience is proving its worth. Allies are watching, adversaries are calculating, markets are adjusting, and inside the institutions themselves, everyone understands that the outcomes will be defined not by rhetoric, but by adherence to rules, chains of command, and constitutional obligation. Collapse is not inevitable, but neither is inaction. The stakes are procedural, the consequences are operational. The signal is clear, the institutions will hold. And holding under pressure is not easy. But it is what differentiates a functioning system from a failing one. This is no longer about one political figure. It is about the enduring framework of authority, oversight, and accountability that sustains governance when personalities seek to bend it. Stress is high. Observers are alert. And history will mark this moment not for drama, but for the quiet assertion that rules, when enforced, matter more than any single individual. Trump's options are narrowing. He can escalate rhetorically, call rallies, issue denunciations, frame refusal as treason. He can pursue legal action, challenge the Pentagon's stance as insubordination, though legal experts see little chance of success. Or he can test the perimeter indirectly, through sympathetic state officials or legislative pressure. Each path carries risk. Meanwhile, the institutions appear locked in. What began as containment has shifted toward isolation, cutting off informal channels, tightening procedures, documenting everything. Force protection levels at key facilities have quietly increased out of an abundance of caution, a phrase that always signals more than it says. Globally, allies are recalibrating. Some European capitals are accelerating independent defense planning. Indo-Pacific partners are quietly seeking reassurance that American command authority remains stable and predictable. Credibility, once questioned, is slow to recover. This moment presents three possible trajectories. First, enforcement. Institutions hold. Legal mechanisms engage. Pressure dissipates through procedure. Second, confrontation. Loyalty fractures, public support surges, and extra-constitutional tensions escalate. Third, transformation. A defining clash that reshapes executive power, military autonomy, and civilian oversight for a generation. What is certain is this. The old assumptions are gone. The assumption that loyalty follows personality. The assumption that pressure always bends institutions. The assumption that escalation guarantees compliance. Those assumptions broke today. The line has been drawn, not by rhetoric, but by refusal. And once institutions choose restraint over accommodation, the system enters a different phase, one governed not by ambition, but by rules. What happens next will determine whether those rules still hold.